"There's nothing left, Aria," he said, voice trembling just enough to sound believable as he slid the divorce papers across the table. The air smelled like cold coffee and deceit. I remember the way his hand hovered over the pen, a man pretending defeat while hiding a grin behind tired eyes. He was performing heartbreak, but my phone wasn't fooled. One buzz, one alert, and his entire act unraveled. A bank notification. $500,000 quietly transferred into an offshore account I'd never seen. The name on it. A fake company registered 3 months before he filed for divorce, the same month I caught him working late. He thought he'd buried the trail. He forgot who helped him dig the ground. For a moment, everything went silent except the sound of my heartbeat. I stared at him, wondering how many lies I'd missed while cooking dinner, while cheering for him, while believing in the man he pretended to be. He sighed like a man cornered by fate. "You got what you wanted," he muttered, not realizing how much he'd just confessed. I smiled, not out of forgiveness, but out of clarity. He believed I'd crumble under betrayal. But betrayal has a strange effect on people like me. It doesn't break us, it sharpens us. He leaned back, confident again, thinking I'd never notice the small details. The shifted accounts, the erased emails, the new name he used. But the truth has a way of bleeding through cracks, and I could already see it spilling everywhere. The woman he once underestimated was no longer blinded by love. She was guided by proof. When someone hides the truth, they never expect the one they wronged to dig deeper. But I was already digging, and this time, I wasn't looking for closure. I was looking for justice. Before I tell you how I uncovered every secret he thought I'd never find, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss how karma flipped this story. Lumitech Design started in a cramped apartment kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and overworked dreams. Cole and I were two ambitious nobodies with a single shared laptop and a wild belief that talent alone could rewrite our story. We'd work until sunrise, scribbling ideas on napkins, surviving on takeout and promises. Back then, every little victory felt sacred. The first client, the first office, the first late-night celebration over sparkling water because we couldn't afford champagne. We were partners, in life and in business, and I believed that made us unbreakable. He used to say, "Aria, this company is our baby. We built it together." And I believed him. I stayed up editing pitch decks, smoothing over client calls when his temper flared, balancing our books when numbers didn't quite add up. I was the calm to his chaos, the one who turned his rough sketches into something investors could trust. But somewhere between success and comfort, something shifted. His late nights became longer, and his stories about private meetings stopped matching his calendar. One night, I remember asking, "We're a team, right?" He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Always," he said, voice steady, eyes cold. I brushed it off then, telling myself that exhaustion had stolen his warmth. But looking back, that moment was the crack where everything started to split. He began locking his office door, changing passwords we used to share, and brushing off my questions with that same patronizing smile. "You worry too much, Aria." But I wasn't worrying, I was noticing. His tone, his distance, the way his phone seemed to vibrate more often when I walked into the room. What hurt most wasn't the secrecy. It was how practiced he'd become at lying while pretending to love me. The foundation we built with loyalty and sacrifice was quietly being replaced with manipulation and greed. And while I didn't see it then, Lumitech Designs had stopped being ours long before I discovered what he'd done. The first red flag didn't scream, it whispered. It came as a small line item buried in a sea of invoices, something that should have gone unnoticed on any other day. I was going through Lumitech's monthly statements, cross-checking figures, the way I always did. But one invoice stood out, an unfamiliar client name, a strangely rounded amount, and a signature that made my stomach twist. It was Cole's handwriting, but something about the document felt off. The company name wasn't ours. Instead of Lumitech Designs, it read Lumitech Holdings. At first, I thought it was a typo. We had never registered another branch, and the formatting looked too deliberate to be accidental. I clicked open the client record, a project supposedly handled 6 months earlier, yet there were no design files, no correspondence, no work orders. Just a payment confirmation from an offshore bank. I remember whispering, "This doesn't make sense," to myself, but deep down, something already did. The numbers weren't wrong, they were hidden. When Cole got home that evening, I decided to ask him casually, pretending curiosity rather than suspicion. He dropped his keys, poured himself a drink, and gave me that same effortless grin that used to charm investors. "Hey, Cole," I said, holding up my tablet. "Why does this say Lumitech Holdings instead of Designs?" He paused just a second too long, the kind of pause that only registers when you're paying attention. Then he chuckled, waving it off like a minor clerical error. "That's a different branch, babe. A holding account for consulting work. Don't stress about it." His tone was light, practiced. But the laugh, that's what gave him away. It wasn't the laugh of a man explaining something harmless. It was too smooth, too rehearsed, the kind of sound that carries a trace of arrogance. I smiled back to keep him comfortable, but inside, every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. After he went to bed, I stayed up at the kitchen counter, staring at that invoice like it was a confession. The logo looked too new, too polished. The signature, his, slanted slightly differently, as if he'd practiced forging his own name. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was overanalyzing, that love sometimes makes people paranoid. But love shouldn't make you second-guess logic. Over the next week, I started noticing other things. New business cards in his briefcase, missing entries in our accounting software, quiet phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. He'd started guarding his laptop like it held state secrets. One night, I walked in to find him quickly closing a spreadsheet. "Just numbers," he said, smiling that same empty smile. But I knew numbers. And numbers don't lie unless someone makes them. That was the night I created a separate folder on my own drive, labeled simply Invoices to Review. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a beginning. I stopped asking direct questions and started observing. His stories didn't line up. His timelines overlapped. His expense reports told tales he didn't. The laugh I'd once loved had turned into a warning. Every sound, every gesture now carried a second meaning. He thought he'd brushed off my curiosity with a simple lie, but he'd only done one thing: he made me start paying attention. And once I started, I couldn't stop. The betrayal didn't crash into my life all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a string unraveling from a sweater I'd worn too long. Every thread I pulled led to another, and each one carried a truth I didn't want to face. The first time I saw the second bank account, I told myself it was just a backup. The second time, I noticed it had deposits matching our client payments, and none of them reflected on Lumitech's main ledger. The numbers formed patterns, deliberate and careful. He wasn't making mistakes. He was building a hidden empire. Cole had always been meticulous, almost obsessive about organization. But now, that same trait was working against him. Passwords he changed monthly, files labeled with odd acronyms, and calendar entries marked as consults during weekends. I started tracing them, not from anger, but from the need to understand how far he'd gone. Every discovery was a small betrayal, and together they painted a portrait of greed disguised as genius. One night, I followed him from the office, keeping a few cars behind. He wasn't going to a meeting like he'd claimed. He stopped at a restaurant across town, the kind with frosted glass and too many exits. I watched as he met a woman I didn't recognize. Young, confident, dressed like she belonged in one of his corporate pitches. She handed him a folder, and he handed her an envelope. I didn't stay to see what was inside. I didn't need to. The next morning, I confided in Maya, my oldest friend, someone who'd been there since our first days at Lumitech. I needed to say it out loud, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. "Maya, I think Cole's hiding money. And maybe more than that." She looked at me with sympathy that felt sharp, not soft. "You're just emotional, Aria," she said gently. "Divorces do this to people. Don't make this uglier than it already is." Her words hurt more than she realized. In that moment, I understood, I was alone in this. After that conversation, I stopped sharing and started documenting. Late nights blurred into dawn as I sifted through emails, scanned statements, and backed up files onto a hidden drive. I started noticing inconsistencies in contracts, client names that led nowhere, addresses that didn't exist, and transactions dated on days we hadn't even worked. He'd built a parallel version of Lumatech, a ghost company, identical to ours but funneling funds somewhere else. The isolation crept in quietly. I'd lie awake listening to the soft hum of his phone charging beside the bed, wondering if it was the same device he used to move our money. He still smiled at me in the mornings, still said "love you" before leaving, as if routine could mask deception. But routine had become my camouflage, too. Every time he underestimated me, I took note. Every time he lied, I found another clue. And when guilt whispered that I was crossing a line, I reminded myself, trust isn't blindness, it's a choice. He chose to break it. I chose to see. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof, waiting for me to find it. When trust breaks, the silence that follows can feel unbearable. Aria had spent weeks buried in evidence, emails, receipts, and bank statements that screamed the truth no one wanted to admit. But every clue felt incomplete, every discovery led to another locked door. She needed help, not emotional comfort, but clarity. That's when she thought of Ethan Voss. Ethan wasn't just an old co-worker. Back at Lumatech, he was the kind of engineer who could find the pulse in any system, the one who joked that every secret has a circuit. They hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, not since he'd quit after clashing with Cole over creative ethics. The irony wasn't lost on her. She hesitated before sending the message. "Hey, Ethan. I need your help. It's about Cole." The reply came within minutes. "If he's hiding money, we'll find it. People leave digital footprints, even ghosts." When they met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, Ethan looked different, a little older, maybe more cautious, but his mind was still razor-sharp. He didn't ask for gossip. Instead, he opened his laptop and got straight to work. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Show me what you've got." Aria slid a flash drive across the table. It contained everything she'd collected, the files, screenshots, even photos of documents she couldn't print without raising suspicion. Ethan's eyes flickered as lines of code filled the screen. "You were right to suspect," he murmured. "But this is sophisticated. Whoever built this didn't want to be found." He explained that Cole wasn't just hiding money, he was laundering it through microtransactions disguised as project expenses. Each client he invented was linked to offshore wallets and led through anonymous digital chains. "He's using cryptocurrency tunnels," Ethan said. "It's clever, but not invisible. See this?" He pointed to a metadata tag buried deep in the transaction logs. "That's a timestamp he forgot to erase. It ties back to his main account." Aria felt a mix of anger and awe. Cole hadn't just betrayed her emotionally, he'd underestimated her intelligence. "So what do we do?" she asked. Ethan smirked. "We map his network. Quietly. The goal isn't to confront him, it's to corner him." They began working in secret, creating encrypted backups and using burner drives to trace patterns. Nights blurred into early mornings. Aria would make coffee while Ethan's fingers danced across the keyboard, decoding layers of encryption like peeling skin from a lie. They discovered that Cole had registered multiple shell companies, each tied to false IP addresses bouncing through servers in different countries. "What's he building?" she whispered one night, staring at a web of connections glowing on Ethan's screen. Ethan leaned closer. "A financial echo. He's creating shadows of himself, versions that can't be touched by law." It wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a secret war beneath the surface of everyday calm. Aria would smile during morning meetings, pretend everything was normal at lunch, and then slip away to continue their investigation after dark. Every beep of her phone made her pulse spike, fear that Cole might somehow know. But working with Ethan brought something unexpected. Steadiness. He didn't pity her, he respected her focus. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. Between decoding data and tracing funds, they talked, not about the past, but about what truth costs. "Sometimes," Ethan said, "people don't hide money because they need it. They hide it because they like control. It's about power." Those words stuck with her. Control, that was Cole's currency. Every lie, every secret file, every stolen payment was his way of asserting it. But now, the balance was shifting. Aria wasn't the naive partner who ignored the signs. She was the woman taking back the narrative. One evening, Ethan looked up from his screen and said quietly, "We've got him." He turned the laptop toward her. On it was a trail leading to a private offshore vault, one Cole had set up months before their separation. The folder name was personal, almost cruelly sentimental, Air_projects. Aria stared at the name, realizing he'd hidden his betrayal behind her initials, the same one she'd once proudly stamped on every design. It was poetic and devastating all at once. She leaned back, breathing deeply, the room spinning with both triumph and heartbreak. "He thought he could erase me," she said softly. "But he left my mark on the crime itself." And in that quiet victory, Aria finally understood. Betrayal isn't just about being deceived. It's about reclaiming the power to see, and refusing to look away. The day Aria realized she didn't need permission to fight back was the day everything shifted. It wasn't loud or cinematic, no dramatic music, no tearful breakdown, just a steady, conscious decision that she would no longer play the role of the woman waiting to be rescued. It started small. She sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, fingers trembling as she typed forensic accounting for beginners. A week earlier, those words would have felt foreign, impossible. But now, they were oxygen. She watched videos late into the night, bookmarked online courses, and joined anonymous forums under the name Novaray. What began as curiosity turned into obsession. Every article, every spreadsheet, every lecture about shell corporations and hidden assets was another piece of armor. At first, the numbers made her head ache. She wasn't a finance expert. She was a designer, someone who saw the world in colors and angles, not decimal points and ledgers. But slowly, the fog cleared. The more she learned, the more everything Cole had done began to make sense. Each hidden transaction was a pattern, each withdrawal a signature. She could see him in the data, his arrogance encoded in numbers, his deceit printed in timelines. She started waking up early, studying before sunrise. Her dining table turned into a command center, stacks of printed statements, highlighters in sharp neon shades, sticky notes covered in theories and account names. The same meticulous attention to design she once poured into her company now fueled her investigation. Every mistake she found, every inconsistency she decoded, gave her back a piece of herself. One afternoon, she noticed her wedding ring glinting in the corner of her vision, a small, familiar flash of gold that suddenly felt foreign. She slid it off, holding it in her palm. The ring had once symbolized unity, but now it felt like a chain. Without thinking twice, she replaced it with a plain silver band she'd bought from a local artisan. Simple, unadorned, imperfect. "This," she whispered, looking at her reflection, "is the circle that belongs only to me." It wasn't about rejecting her past. It was about reclaiming her identity. That moment marked a silent rebirth, a transformation rooted not in vengeance but in clarity. Ethan noticed the change immediately. When they met again to review her latest findings, he smiled faintly. "You've been busy," he said, scanning her spreadsheets. "These are cleaner than anything I've seen in corporate audits." Aria smirked. "Guess I'm learning to think like a thief, just so I can beat one." The confidence in her voice surprised even her. Gone was the shaky tone of self-doubt. Every sentence she spoke now carried precision, purpose. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was strategizing. Her transformation wasn't only intellectual, it was emotional. She began journaling again, something she'd stopped when the marriage started falling apart. Each page became a record of lessons learned. Trust actions, not words. Ask questions even when it feels uncomfortable. Learn what power looks like in numbers. But she also began forgiving herself, for not seeing the signs, for believing the best in someone who didn't deserve it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant freedom. There were nights when exhaustion crept in, when the loneliness of her mission pressed against her chest. But she had something stronger now, resolve. She no longer saw herself as a victim or detective. She was a woman rewriting her story in real time. To keep her focus sharp, she started running at dawn, headphones in, playlists filled with instrumental tracks that mirrored her rhythm. Each stride felt symbolic, as if she were literally outrunning the ghost of the woman she used to be. Neighbors would nod as she passed, unaware that behind her calm expression was a storm of intelligence and quiet defiance. By the end of that month, she could read a financial statement like a language. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations, forged expense logs, none of it scared her anymore. What once felt like chaos now felt like choreography. Cole had played a long game of deceit, but Aria was mastering a longer one: patience, precision, and persistence. When she finally stood in front of the mirror one evening, reviewing her notes before confronting the next step, she didn't see the same woman who had once cried over broken promises. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes steady, her presence electric. She whispered to her reflection, not in anger but in affirmation, "He built this web. I learned how to walk through it." Aria had crossed an invisible threshold, from heartbreak to empowerment, from confusion to command. And though the world outside didn't yet know it, she had already won the most important battle, the one against the version of herself that used to settle for less. This wasn't just survival. It was evolution, a quiet, unstoppable transformation written in courage, logic, and silver. The courtroom felt colder than Aria expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, but the kind that seeps into your bones when truth and lies are about to collide. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and deliberate, signaling the start of the final hearing. Cole sat across from her, dressed in a muted grey suit that looked intentionally worn. He'd even skipped his usual designer watch. It was a performance, a man trying to look broken. When his lawyer stood to speak, the words dripped with false humility. "Mr. Gaines has nothing left, Your Honor. The business failed, the accounts are empty, and he's already surrendered his vehicle as part of his good faith effort." Cole added, with a sigh that sounded rehearsed, "She can take the car. That's all I have left." He even glanced at her with that same pitying look he used to wear whenever he wanted to guilt her into silence. Aria didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her silver band glinting under the fluorescent light. Every breath she took was deliberate. Every second, measured. She had waited months for this moment, and she wasn't about to let emotions cloud her precision. Then, Layla Stone, her lawyer, sharp as a blade and calm as a surgeon, stood up. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and unhurried, "we have additional evidence that contradicts the defendant's statements." The judge arched a brow. "Proceed." Layla turned to Aria, gave a small nod, and tapped the projector remote. The first image flickered onto the courtroom screen, a chain of transactions routed through what appeared to be a dormant company, Lumatech Holdings. Cole stiffened. Layla continued, "Upon further investigation, we discovered multiple shell corporations registered under Mr. Gaines' business alias. Funds were transferred from joint accounts into these entities shortly before the divorce filing." She clicked again. More evidence appeared, screenshots of crypto wallets, transfers to offshore banks, and documents with digital signatures unmistakably his. Each slide was another nail in the coffin of his deception. Aria's narration deepened, screens lit up, one after another, transfers, shell accounts, crypto logs. His fake empire collapsed in seconds. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs and clicking pens, fell completely silent. You could almost hear the weight of realization settle over everyone present. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as she scanned the documents. Cole's lawyer tried to object, but his voice faltered halfway. Cole's hands fidgeted in his lap. The color drained from his face. Gone was the confident smirk he'd worn during the early hearings. Now, he looked small, cornered by the very web he'd spun. Layla wasn't finished. "We've also submitted evidence of cryptocurrency transactions linked to a wallet address verified under Mr. Gaines' personal email. The total concealed assets amount to approximately $872,000. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Maya, who sat quietly in the back, blinked in stunned disbelief. Aria watched Cole's mask crumble, the twitch in his jaw, the frantic glance toward his attorney, the dawning horror that every secret he'd buried was now laid bare. For months, he had treated her as naive, as the emotional one. But today, it was her facts that spoke louder than his lies. Her inner voice whispered, not in triumph, but in quiet justice, You taught me to play your game, Cole. But you forgot, I don't lose. The judge broke the silence, her tone cool but resolute. Mr. Gaines, it appears the court has been misled. We will be reopening the financial evaluation based on this new evidence. Cole tried to speak, his words stumbling. It's a misunderstanding, But the judge cut him off. Enough. The evidence is clear. The sound of her gavel echoed like a final verdict, both legal and poetic. Aria exhaled slowly. For the first time, her breath didn't shake. She looked at Cole, not with hatred, not even with satisfaction, but with a kind of serene closure. He had chosen deceit. She had chosen truth. And in that moment, the difference between them couldn't have been clearer. As they exited the courtroom, Layla turned to her and smiled. You did it. Aria's reply was quiet, but firm. No. We proved it. Because justice wasn't just about winning, it was about being seen, being believed, and reclaiming the story someone tried to rewrite. And in that sterile courtroom filled with digital proof and broken pride, Aria had finally written the ending herself. The air outside the courthouse was crisp, carrying the faint smell of autumn leaves mixed with the sterile scent of city concrete. Aria walked steadily, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step echoing a rhythm of regained control. Behind her, she felt it, the weight of footsteps, hesitant yet determined, closing the distance. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Cole. He caught up to her at the corner, leaning slightly against the brick wall of a nearby cafe. His usually confident posture was collapsed into something unsteady, almost vulnerable. For a moment, the man who had once smirked through lies and deception seemed small, diminished. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture Aria had seen 100 times before, when he was trying to hide a mistake, when he wanted forgiveness without earning it. Aria, he began, voice tight, shaky, almost desperate. Please. I didn't mean it. I panicked. Her gaze didn't waver. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head, yet nothing could have prepared her for the visceral weight of the truth in his words, or the absence of it. Panic was a reaction. Panic was temporary. What she had uncovered was deliberate. His deeds weren't accidental. They weren't moments of weakness. They were calculated. You didn't panic, she said, her voice calm, cold, precise. You planned. Cole's lips parted, trying to find a reply, but nothing came. His eyes darted away, searching the street for witnesses, for some escape from the confrontation he could not manipulate. He realized, in that stark moment, that his usual tools, charm, lies, guilt, no longer worked. She had anticipated his moves, traced every footprint, decoded every transaction, and dismantled every shadow of deceit. There was no room for manipulation, no space for excuses. He stepped closer, as if proximity could shrink the chasm of truth between them. I was scared, he whispered, though it lacked conviction. I didn't think it would get this far. Aria tilted her head slightly, assessing him with the precision of someone who had spent months observing patterns, uncovering secrets, and learning how to outmaneuver deceit. Fear is different from calculation, she said softly, almost pitying. Fear doesn't hide accounts, create shell companies, or lie to the person who trusted you the most. What you did was methodical. You weren't scared. You were selfish. He tried again, his voice cracking. I wanted to fix it. Can we talk? Aria's reply was a quiet, steady affirmation of her transformation. There's nothing to fix. What's broken isn't worth repairing. You chose the path you're on. I chose mine. For a moment, the world felt suspended. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a car honked. Cole's shoulders slumped, the final acknowledgement of defeat. He understood, finally, that no amount of pleading or fabricated regret could undo the exposure of his deception. The silence stretched, heavy and complete. It was not emptiness but filled with a quiet power, the kind that comes from reclaiming agency, from standing undeterred after months of betrayal and painstaking discovery. Aria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every ounce of strength she had gained over those months radiated in that still moment. He looked at her, searching for a reaction, some hint of the woman he had once controlled. Instead, he found composure, clarity, and resolve. She didn't flinch when he shivered in the weight of his own guilt. She didn't soften, didn't console. Her silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Finally, without a backward glance, she turned and continued down the street, each step deliberate, each stride a testament to the months of learning, observing, and reclaiming power. Behind her, Cole remained frozen, the bitter taste of his miscalculation on his tongue, realizing that all the manipulation in the world could not undo the consequences of deliberate choices. The lesson hung in the air as clearly as the fading sunlight, that betrayal might take many forms, but those who choose truth, strategy, and patience will always hold the ultimate advantage. The encounter ended without theatrics, without shouting, without resolution, except for one undeniable truth. Aria had emerged unbroken, and Cole's desperate pleas were meaningless against the quiet, unstoppable force of someone who had rebuilt herself from the ruins of deceit. Months passed, and the quiet hum of everyday life returned, but not for Cole. The cracks he had ignored became chasms, and the world began to notice. Aria didn't have to lift a finger for karma to reach him. It was inevitable. She learned through subtle whispers first, news alerts, casual mentions from clients, murmurs from former colleagues. One by one, the people who had once lined up to support his schemes disappeared. Business partners resigned quietly, emails bounced back, and long-standing investors requested audits. The empire he thought was untouchable was crumbling without a single dramatic confrontation from her side. Then came the IRS investigation. Official letters, subpoenas, and requests for documentation landed at his address and at every business entity he had touched. The same man who had feigned poverty in court now faced audits that would strip him of credibility, assets, and respect. Transactions he had carefully hidden were now under scrutiny, every offshore account examined under a lens sharper than he had ever imagined. A mistake, a misstep, even a timestamp he hadn't erased became evidence. Meanwhile, the internet was merciless. Cole's name trended on social media, not as a success story, but as a cautionary tale. Headlines screamed of financial deceit, fraudulent transfers, and the collapse of a once promising entrepreneur. Friends and colleagues who had once called him genius now called him a scammer. Memes circulated in quiet office groups, and even news sites highlighted the irony. The man who had lied to everyone, even his wife, had been undone by the truth she had unearthed. Aria, however, didn't sit back passively. While Cole floundered in the chaos he had sown, she focused on building her own future. Aria Designs was born not from vengeance, but from vision. The name symbolized light, clarity, growth, and illumination after darkness. She poured herself into design work with renewed focus, creating a brand that reflected her ethos: transparent, innovative, and independent. Every pitch she delivered, every contract she signed, was a statement that she didn't need to rely on someone else's empire to thrive. Clients noticed the difference. They responded not only to her creative skill but to the integrity she carried into every project. Former investors who had watched her grow with Cole now approached her directly. She had learned the value of diligence, of vigilance, and of trusting her instincts, lessons he had tried to undermine but could never erase. Sitting in her new studio one evening, Aria reflected quietly, reviewing sketches and notes for an upcoming campaign. Her narration, calm and measured, filled the room in her mind. He hid his fortune in lies. I found my freedom in truth. Those words weren't bravado, they were recognition of her journey. The months of investigation, the late nights decoding transactions, the patience required to let truth surface, they had transformed her from someone reactive into someone proactive, someone who understood that empowerment wasn't just about revenge, but about creating a life untainted by deceit. Aria Designs grew steadily, earning awards, recognition, and respect. Aria never flaunted her victory over Cole. She let her success speak. Every project completed, every satisfied client, was a quiet testament to resilience and intelligence. She mentored young designers, teaching them to value integrity as much as skill. The very principles Cole had ignored became the foundation of her new life. Meanwhile, reports of Cole's downfall continued to surface. Legal penalties, financial restitution, and public scrutiny became his constant companions. For Aria, it was almost surreal. A man who had tried to erase her life now struggled to maintain his own. Karma hadn't been dramatic or violent. It had been meticulous, quiet, and inevitable. Aria stood in her studio, the soft glow of the evening sun illuminating sketches on her desk, and realized something profound. She hadn't just reclaimed material security, she had reclaimed herself. Her independence, her confidence, her ability to discern truth from deception. Those were victories no one could take away. And as Solaria designs flourished, she finally understood the purest form of justice. Living well, with integrity, while those who betrayed her faced the consequences of their own choices. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about transformation, empowerment, and the unshakable strength that comes from facing betrayal head-on and choosing to rise above it. The truth, Aria knew, would always outshine lies, and in that light, she had built not just a company, but a life that belonged entirely to her. Sitting in the quiet of her studio, Aria traced her fingers along the edge of her drafting table, the soft hum of her computer and the faint city noises outside creating a background rhythm she had come to find comforting. The journey she had endured, from trust to betrayal, confusion to clarity, despair to empowerment, felt almost cinematic in its intensity, yet it had been lived in the small, deliberate moments. Each spreadsheet she had analyzed, each hidden file she had uncovered, each conversation she had had with Ethan and Layla had been a step along a path that demanded patience, strategy, and above all, self-belief. Looking back, she realized that the concept of karma had never been something she actively chased. It didn't require her to strike back or to orchestrate revenge. Karma, she reflected, had its own timing, its own justice. What she had done was not act out of spite, but act in alignment with truth. Every careful step, every decision to remain meticulous, had positioned her not just to expose Cole, but to reclaim her own life and her own power. Karma doesn't chase, it waits. And when it arrives, it always knows where to land. Her reflection deepened as she considered the subtler lessons of her experience. Trust, she realized, was sacred but not naive. Awareness was not cynicism, it was responsibility. And freedom, real freedom, came not from revenge, but from the courage to face reality with eyes wide open, and the determination to rebuild from the ruins left by deception. Every sketch on her desk, every contract signed for Solaria Designs, was a testament to this truth. She had not only survived, she had transformed. Aria thought of the people who might see her story, those who had been blindsided by betrayal, those who had felt powerless in the face of manipulation, and those still learning to navigate the delicate balance between trust and caution. Her voice, calm and measured in her narration, would carry a message. Strength comes from knowledge, from persistence, from refusing to allow deceit to define your future. It wasn't about crushing someone else. It was about rising above them with integrity and tact. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across her studio, she imagined the next story she would tell, the next tale of truth catching up with lies. She knew that people were drawn to stories of justice, to moments where patience and intelligence could overcome malice. It wasn't just entertainment, it was validation, inspiration, and a reminder that actions have consequences. Finally, she looked into the camera, the same quiet confidence she had carried through every challenge reflected in her gaze. Karma doesn't chase, it waits. And when it arrives, it always knows where to land. Her tone was soft but unwavering, the kind of certainty that only comes from lived experience. She allowed a pause, letting the weight of the words settle. And if this story kept you hooked till the end, she continued, voice steady and inviting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next tale will prove that karma always finds its way. Every betrayal has a reckoning, every lie meets truth, and every story has a moment where justice arrives quietly, decisively, and inevitably. The message wasn't just for Cole or for anyone who had tried to manipulate her. It was for everyone watching, that no matter how cleverly someone hides the truth, the combination of patience, awareness, and integrity ensures that truth eventually surfaces. And in that revelation lies not only justice, but empowerment, freedom, and the unshakable knowledge that your life can be reclaimed, one deliberate, courageous step at a time. Aria exhaled, a sense of peace settling over her. The story had ended, but its lessons would echo far beyond that courtroom, that apartment, that city street. Karma, she knew, didn't need chasing. It only needed honesty, vigilance, and the willingness to rise above, and in that, she had already won.